The phone rang at 3:47 a.m., shattering the silence of Victor Castellano's penthouse like a gunshot through glass. In 35 years of building an empire from nothing, Victor had learned that calls at this hour meant only two things. Someone was dead, or someone was about to be. His hand found the phone in the darkness, muscle memory from 1,000 emergencies, and Detective Sarah Martinez's voice came through with the careful tone people used when delivering news that would change everything. "Mr. Castellano, this is Detective Martinez with the NYPD. I need you to come to Pier 7. There's been a discovery at your construction site. We've found human remains, multiple victims." She paused, and Victor could hear other voices in the background, the crackle of police radios, the organized chaos of a crime scene in motion. "Sir, we've made a preliminary identification on one of the bodies. I think you should get down here immediately." Victor sat up in the darkness of his bedroom, the city lights from 40 stories below painting everything in shades of blue and grey. His second wife, Elena, stirred beside him but didn't wake. The clock on the nightstand glowed 3:48 a.m. "Who did you find?" Another pause, longer this time. "Sir, I'd prefer to discuss this in person." "Detective, I'm not getting dressed and driving to a construction site in the middle of the night without knowing why. Who did you identify?" "Roberto Castellano," Martinez said finally. "Your father. We found your father's body at Pier 7, Mr. Castellano, along with 3 other victims, all of them buried approximately 35 years ago." The world stopped. Victor's hand tightened on the phone until his knuckles went white, until the plastic creaked with the pressure. But he couldn't feel it. He couldn't feel anything except the sudden vacuum where his understanding of his entire life had been 3 seconds ago. Roberto Castellano, his father, not disappeared, not abandoned, not the coward who'd walked away from his family with gambling debts and shame. Murdered, buried, hidden for 35 years at Pier 7, which in 1989 had been Moretti territory. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Victor said, and his voice came out steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. He ended the call and sat in the darkness, staring at nothing while his brain processed implications that spread outward like cracks in ice. Every choice he'd made since he was 23 years old had been about proving he wasn't his father. Every ruthless decision, every burned bridge, every relationship sacrificed for the empire he built, all of it based on the story that Roberto Castellano had abandoned him. The story was a lie. And Salvatore Moretti, the man Victor had been at peace with for 12 years, the man whose family's territory had included Pier 7 in 1989, had let Victor believe that lie for 35 years. Victor dressed in the darkness, black suit and white shirt moving through familiar motions, while his mind raced ahead to consequences and responses and the question of whether the truce that had kept both families alive for 12 years could survive this. The peace had been built on mutual exhaustion after a war that killed 23 people and nearly bankrupted both families. But peace built on pragmatism was fragile. Peace could shatter. Peace was about to shatter. At Pier 7, Victor stood at the edge of the excavation site, while forensic technicians worked under floodlights that turned night into harsh, artificial day. The waterfront stretched behind him, dark water reflecting city lights in fractured patterns that looked like the world breaking apart. The November air was cold enough to see breath, to feel the chill penetrating expensive fabric, to understand that some kinds of cold had nothing to do with temperature. Detective Martinez walked him through the preliminary findings with professional detachment. 4 bodies, all male, ages 45 to 55 at time of death, buried approximately 32 to 38 years ago, based on degradation patterns and soil composition analysis. We found personal effects with all 4 victims: wallets, watches, wedding rings. Whoever buried them wanted them identified eventually. She led Victor to an evidence table where items were laid out in clear plastic bags with numbered tags. Roberto's wallet. The leather had degraded to the texture of old paper, but the driver's license inside was still readable behind its laminated protection. The photo showed Roberto younger than Victor was now, dark-haired and smiling, unaware that he had weeks left to live. His watch was a cheap Timex that had stopped at 11:47, frozen at the moment it left his wrist or the moment the battery died, time captured and held for 35 years. The wedding ring was simple gold, worn smooth from years of wear, the inscription inside still visible, LC plus RC, 1965. Your grandmother's initials? Martinez asked, noting Victor's attention to the ring. My mother's, Victor said quietly. Laura Castellano. She died in 1997. Cancer. She spent the last 12 years of her life believing her husband abandoned her, died never knowing what really happened to him. Martinez made notes, but her eyes held sympathy that seemed genuine. Mr. Castellano, I have to ask, do you have any information about who might have been responsible for your father's death? Anyone who had conflicts with him in 1989? Anyone who might have wanted him to disappear? Victor looked at the excavation site, at the disturbed earth where his father had been buried like garbage for 35 years, at the yellow crime scene tape that marked the boundary between before and after. Pier 7 had been Moretti Maritime Solutions in 1989. Salvatore Moretti's company, Salvatore's property, Salvatore's decision about who got buried here and who didn't. No, Victor lied smoothly, because telling the truth meant police. Involvement meant investigations that would expose both families to scrutiny neither could afford, meant consequences beyond his control. My father disappeared in November 1989. We assumed he'd left the city. This is the first I'm learning about what actually happened to him. Martinez didn't look convinced, but she nodded. We'll be interviewing anyone who worked at this location in 1989, trying to piece together what happened. If you remember anything that might help our investigation, please contact me immediately. Of course, Victor said. Whatever I can do to help. The lie tasted like metal, like blood, like the beginning of something that couldn't be stopped once it started. He turned to leave, then paused at the edge of the crime scene, his phone already in his hand. The call he was about to make would set everything in motion, questions that demanded answers, truths that couldn't be unspoken, consequences that would ripple outward through both families regardless of what anyone wanted. The phone rang 3 times before Salvatore Moretti answered. Victor. Just his name. Calm, resigned. Like Salvatore had been expecting this call for 35 years. You killed my father, Victor said, and his voice was ice. Not rage yet. That would come later. Just the absolute zero that preceded violence, the temperature where grief turned into action. You killed Roberto Castellano and buried him at Pier 7 and let me spend 35 years believing he abandoned us. Silence on the other end of the line. Not denial, not explanation, just silence that confirmed everything. I need to know why, Victor continued, his voice dropping even quieter, forcing Salvatore to listen harder. I need to understand what my father did that made you decide he needed to disappear. I need the truth, Salvatore, all of it, and then I need to decide whether that truth changes anything or whether it just makes this worse. More silence. Then Salvatore's voice, carrying the weight of decades. I'll tell you everything. What happened? Why it happened? what I've been carrying for 35 years. But Victor, you need to understand. No, Victor cut him off. No explanations over the phone. No prepared statements. We meet, face to face. You look me in the eyes and tell me why you took my father from me and let me build my entire life around a lie. His hand tightened on the phone. Marcello's restaurant, tomorrow night, 7 p.m. You bring your consigliere. I'll bring Elena. We talk, and then we decide whether the truce just ended. Victor, Salvatore started, but Victor had already disconnected because there was nothing else to say until tomorrow night. Nothing else that mattered except the truth about Roberto Castellano and whether that truth could possibly justify 35 years of lies. He stood in the parking lot of Pier 7 as dawn began to break, watching the sky lighten from black to deep blue to the orange-pink of sunrise. The forensic team continued their work, methodically cataloguing evidence that would never lead anywhere, because powerful men didn't go to prison for 35-year-old murders when all the witnesses were dead or loyal. The system wasn't designed to deliver justice to people like the Morettis and Castellanos. Justice was something you created yourself. His phone buzzed, a text from his son, Nico. Dad, I heard about Pier 7. I'm coming to the office. Don't make any decisions until we talk. Victor texted back, too late. Already made them. Meet me at the office in 1 hour. And Nico, come ready to plan, because this isn't over. This is just beginning. Across the river, in the kitchen of the Moretti estate, Lucia Moretti had been awake since 3:30 a.m., making soup she didn't need. The big pot simmered on the stove, filling the pre-dawn kitchen with the smell of tomatoes and garlic and herbs that had comforted 3 generations of this family through wars and weddings and births and deaths and all the moments in between. Her hands moved through familiar patterns, chop the celery, dice the onion, crush the garlic, while her mind worked on the problem she'd been dreading for 35 years. Salvatore hadn't come to bed. She'd heard him in his study since midnight, making phone calls in the voice he used when trying to contain something that wanted to explode. 48 years of marriage taught you to read your husband's silences, to understand the difference between regular insomnia and the kind of sleeplessness that meant the past was catching up with choices made in the dark. At 4:15 a.m., Salvatore's consigliere Enzo Ferrara arrived at the house without calling first, which meant the situation was already worse than bad. Lucia heard the front door open, heard the 2 men's voices low and urgent in the hallway, heard them move into Salvatore's study and close the door with the soft click that said what came next was family business of the darkest kind. She turned off the stove, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked down the hallway to the study. She didn't knock. After 48 years, she'd earned the right to enter any room in this house without permission. Salvatore and Enzo sat with crime scene photographs spread across the desk between them like evidence at a trial. 4 body bags, yellow police tape, excavation equipment, the cold documentation of secrets that refused to stay buried. Salvatore looked up at her with eyes that held the weight of decades, with the expression of a man who'd been waiting for this moment since November 1989. "It's Pier 7, Salvatore said quietly. "Construction crew found the bodies yesterday afternoon. 4 men, all of them buried during the transition after Antonio died." He paused, and Lucia saw the resignation in his face. Roberto Castellano was one of them. Lucia's hand found the back of the chair, steadying herself against news she'd been expecting for years but had hoped would never actually arrive. Roberto Castellano, Victor Castellano's father. The man Salvatore had killed, or ordered killed, in November 1989 when Roberto had been selling information to the Russos during the most vulnerable moment in the family's history. She'd been 7 months pregnant with Valentina when it happened. had watched Salvatore come home at 4 a.m. with dirt under his fingernails and blood on his shoes that he'd burned in the backyard while she held him in the darkness, and understood without being told that some choices couldn't be undone, only endured. "Victor knows," she said. Not a question. "Victor called me an hour ago from the crime scene," Salvatore replied. "He knows his father was buried at Pier 7. He knows it was my property in 1989. He knows I've let him believe Roberto abandoned him for 35 years. His voice was steady, but his hands weren't, trembling slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "We're meeting tomorrow night at Marcello's. I'm going to tell him everything. What Roberto did, why I made the choice I made, why I left the personal effects deliberately so someone would find him eventually. And then Victor will decide whether understanding the circumstances changes anything." "It won't," Enzo said quietly from his position by the window. "Understanding might reduce the rage from boiling to simmering, but it won't eliminate it. Victor spent 35 years building his identity in opposition to a father he thought abandoned him. Learning the truth doesn't give him those years back. It just makes the loss more complicated." Before anyone could respond, Salvatore's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his expression shifted to something more guarded. "It's Detective Martinez, the one handling the Pier 7 investigation." He answered on speaker. "Detective, it's early for a follow-up call." Martinez's voice came through with professional courtesy that barely masked underlying steel. "Mr. Moretti, I apologize for the early hour, but there's a development you need to be aware of. The DA's office has taken a particular interest in the Pier 7 discovery. Given the location's history and the organized crime connections that are, frankly, impossible to ignore, they're considering launching a broader RICO investigation into waterfront operations from the late 80s and early 90s. Salvatore's face went carefully neutral. "Detective, I'm not sure what you're implying. My family has operated legitimate businesses for—" "Mr. Moretti," Martinez interrupted, her tone suggesting she'd heard this speech before and wasn't impressed. "Let me be direct. The DA is giving me 72 hours to gather evidence and witness cooperation regarding the Pier 7 murders. If I can show them that both your family and the Castellanos are willing to work with law enforcement to provide information that helps us understand what happened in 1989, then they might be satisfied with closing a cold case. But if I get stonewalled, if witnesses suddenly can't remember anything, and evidence mysteriously disappears, then the DA will interpret that as confirmation that there's something much bigger to investigate. And trust me, a full RICO investigation into both families will make the Pier 7 murders look like a footnote." The silence in the study was absolute. Lucia watched her husband process this new variable, watched him calculate implications and responses with the tactical mind that had kept him alive and powerful for 5 decades. 72 hours, Salvatore repeated. "Starting from this morning, 8 a.m., Martinez confirmed. "That gives you until Thursday morning. Mr. Moretti, I'm telling you this as a professional courtesy because I believe you're someone who understands that cooperation serves everyone's interests better than confrontation. Talk to Victor Castellano. Figure out what story you're both comfortable telling. Give me something I can take to the DA that suggests this was a tragic situation from decades ago that doesn't require destroying 2 families today. Because if I walk into that office on Thursday with nothing, a lot of people are going to have a very bad year." She hung up before Salvatore could respond. Enzo broke the silence first. "She just gave us 3 days to either reach an understanding with the Castellanos or prepare for federal prosecution that could dismantle both families." He looked at Salvatore. "That's not investigator overreach. That's someone who knows exactly how much pressure to apply and where to apply it. She's forcing both families into cooperation by making the alternative unacceptable. Or she's genuine, Lucia said quietly. Maybe she actually believes that two old men talking honestly about choices made in the dark is better than federal prosecutors tearing apart everyone's lives, looking for crimes that don't matter anymore except to the people still carrying them. Salvatore stood and moved to the window, looking out at gardens where his grandchildren would play later this afternoon, unaware that their grandfather's past was about to collide with their present in ways that might define their futures. Either way, the timeline just accelerated. I can't wait until tomorrow night to have this conversation with Victor. We need to talk now. Today. Before lawyers get involved. Before federal pressure makes everyone defensive. Before the story gets locked into positions no one can back down from. He pulled out his phone and called Victor's number. It rang 4 times before Victor answered, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept. Salvatore, if you're calling to prepare your explanation for tomorrow night. The DA just gave us 72 hours, Salvatore interrupted. Detective Martinez called me 15 minutes ago. They're threatening a RICO investigation into both families if we don't cooperate with the Pier 7 investigation. We can't wait until tomorrow night, Victor. We need to talk today. This morning. Before this spirals into something neither of us can control. Victor was silent for several seconds. You want to move up our meeting? I want to tell you the truth before federal prosecutors start telling their version of it, Salvatore said. I want to give you the full story. What happened, why it happened, what I've been carrying, while we still have the option of keeping this between our families. Because once the DA gets involved, once lawyers start positioning and evidence gets subpoenaed and witnesses start talking to prosecutors, we lose control of the narrative. And Victor, there are things about 1989 that neither of us wants federal investigators examining too closely. More silence. Then, Marcello's. Noon today. You, me, and our consigliere. No one else. We talk, and then we decide how to handle Martinez's deadline. Victor's voice dropped to something colder. But, Salvatore, understand this. Moving up the timeline doesn't change what you did. It doesn't make 35 years of lies more acceptable. It just means I'll know the truth sooner. I understand, Salvatore said. I'll see you at noon. He ended the call and looked at Lucia and Enzo, both of whom were watching him with expressions that suggested they understood the stakes had just multiplied. Not just two families navigating their own history, but two families facing external pressure that could force choices no one wanted to make. 72 hours, Enzo said. That's not much time to reach an understanding, establish cooperation, and give Martinez something she can take to the DA that satisfies them without exposing either family to further scrutiny. Then we'd better make those 72 hours count, Salvatore replied. Call everyone, Dominic, Marco, Valentina. Tell them to be here in an hour. They need to know what we're facing and what it might cost. Because if this goes wrong, if Victor and I can't find common ground, everyone in this family needs to be prepared for the consequences. Nico Castellano sat in his father's office at 6:30 a.m., watching dawn paint the city in shades of gold and grey, while Victor stood at the windows in the same position he'd clearly held for hours. The medical examiner's report lay on the desk between them, pages spread open to photographs that documented the end of Roberto Castellano's life and the beginning of Victor's 35-year-old lie. Martinez just called, Victor said without turning from the window. The DA's office is threatening a RICO investigation. We have 72 hours to cooperate with the Pier 7 investigation or face federal prosecutors tearing apart both families, looking for crimes that connect to 1989. He finally turned to face Nico. Salvatore wants to meet today instead of tomorrow night. Noon at Marcello's. He's going to tell me what happened, and then we're going to figure out how to satisfy federal investigators without either of us ending up in prison. Nico absorbed this, his tactical mind immediately recognizing how the compressed timeline changed everything. If you're meeting at noon, That gives us 6 hours to gather as much independent information as possible. Because whatever Salvatore tells you, you want to be able to verify it, or at least understand if he's omitting important details. Agreed, Victor said, which is why you're going to Pier 7. The crime scene is still active, but you have construction company credentials that give you legitimate access to the site. I want you to look around, see if there's anything the police might have missed. Talk to our foreman who found the bodies. Understand what actually got uncovered and whether there's more that could surface. Nico nodded, already mentally mapping the approach. And if I find something that complicates Salvatore's story, then we use it, Victor said simply, because this conversation isn't just about understanding the past. It's about positioning for the future. If Salvatore buried more than 4 bodies at Pier 7, if there are secrets he hasn't mentioned, I need to know that before I sit down across from him. Information is leverage. And right now, leverage is what keeps both families from getting destroyed by federal prosecutors. By 8 a.m., Nico was at Pier 7. The crime scene was still cordoned off with yellow tape, but construction company vehicles were parked nearby and workers were gathered in clusters, talking in low voices about the discovery that had shut down their site. Nico spotted Danny Rodriguez, the foreman who'd made the initial call to police, standing apart from the others, with a cup of coffee and the haunted expression of someone who'd seen things they couldn't unsee. "Danny," Nico called out, walking over with his hard hat and safety vest marking him as legitimate presence. "I'm Nico Castellano. My father owns the company. I need to talk to you about what you found." Rodriguez looked relieved to have someone to talk to. Someone who might have answers instead of just more questions. "Mr. Castellano, I've been doing demolition for 23 years. I've found old foundations, buried equipment, even a few animal remains. But nothing like this. Never 4 bodies wrapped in plastic like they were waiting to be found." "Walk me through it," Nico said. "Where exactly were you digging, and what made you realize you'd found something?" Rodriguez led him to the excavation site, now photographed and documented and partially refilled by forensic teams. "We were taking out the old warehouse foundation, getting down to bedrock so we could pour new supports. The plans showed the original foundation was from the 50s, standard concrete and rebar construction. But when we hit about 8 feet down, right here," he pointed to a section marked with police evidence flags, "we found a secondary layer, newer concrete, poured maybe in the 80s based on the composition. It wasn't on any of the plans. Someone added it. Later, buried something, then covered it up." "A secret foundation," Nico said. "Someone went to significant effort to hide these bodies specifically." "That's what the cops said," Rodriguez agreed. "The detective, Martinez, she told me that whoever did this wanted the bodies preserved but hidden. The plastic wrapping, the concrete layer, even the depth, it was all designed to keep them from being found accidentally but make sure they'd be intact when someone eventually dug deep enough. Like maybe whoever buried them knew that someday someone would develop this property and go deep enough to find what was hidden." Nico filed this away. Salvatore had left evidence deliberately, had created a time capsule of guilt that would eventually surface when construction inevitably came to this waterfront. That suggested something more complex than simple murder and disposal. That suggested a man who wanted the truth to eventually surface, but couldn't afford for it to come out immediately. "Did you find anything else?" Nico asked. "Anything the police might not have noticed or documented?" Rodriguez hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone was close enough to overhear. "There was something. Right before the police arrived, when I was waiting for them, I noticed another section of the foundation about 20 feet north that looked different. Same newer concrete, same deliberate burial. But the police haven't excavated that area yet. They were focused on the 4 bodies we'd already found." Nico felt his pulse quicken. "Show me." Rodriguez led him to a section of the excavation site, just beyond where police had focused their investigation. The exposed foundation did look different here. Newer concrete patchwork that didn't match the surrounding structure, suggesting another deliberate burial from the same time period. "If there are more bodies," Nico said carefully, "or if there's evidence of other activities from 1989 that changes the scope of what we're dealing with, that turns 4 murders into a potential pattern. That's what federal prosecutors look for, evidence of systematic criminal activity rather than isolated incidents." "You want me to dig?" Rodriguez asked, clearly understanding the implications. "No," Nico said. "Leave it alone, but document the location. Photograph it. And if anyone asks, this conversation never happened." He pulled out his phone and took several photos himself, capturing the anomalous concrete work, the location relative to where the bodies were found, the evidence that Pier 7 might be hiding more than anyone had yet discovered. As he was photographing, movement at the edge of the site caught his attention. 2 men in dark jackets, moving with the kind of careful purpose that suggested they weren't construction workers or police. They were headed towards the same section of foundation that Rodriguez had just pointed out, and something about their body language triggered Nico's tactical instincts. "Danny, get back to the trailer," Nico said quietly. "Now. And don't mention seeing me here." Rodriguez took one look at Nico's expression and left without arguing. Nico moved behind a pile of excavation equipment, positioning himself where he could observe without being seen. The 2 men reached the anomalous foundation section and knelt down, one of them pulling out a small handheld device that looked like a ground-penetrating radar scanner. They were searching for something specific. Nico pulled out his phone and zoomed in, taking photos of the men's faces. He recognized one of them, Marcus Donato, one of the Moretti family's senior soldiers, someone who'd been with Salvatore since the 80s. If the Morettis had sent people to Pier 7 to check what else might be buried here, that meant Salvatore knew there were more secrets at this site, knew that the 4 bodies were just the beginning of what could surface. The second man spoke into a radio, his voice too low to make out words, but his tone suggesting urgency. Then both men stood and walked quickly back toward a dark sedan parked on the street. Nico waited until they'd driven away before leaving his hiding position and moving to the exact spot where they'd been scanning. The concrete here looked identical to what Rodriguez had pointed out. Newer work, deliberate burial, something hidden 8 feet down that had nothing to do with the original warehouse foundation. Nico took more photos, documenting the location and the evidence that both families now knew there was more to find at Pier 7. His phone buzzed. A text from Victor. "Meeting moved to 11 a.m. Salvatore's pushing for earlier. Whatever you're finding, wrap it up in the next 2 hours." Nico texted back. "Found secondary burial site. Moretti's just sent people to scan it. Salvatore knows there's more here. We need to talk before you meet him." The response came immediately. "Office, 1 hour. Bring everything." Victor listened to Nico's report with an expression that grew harder with each revelation. The secondary burial site. The Moretti soldiers conducting their own investigation. The evidence that Salvatore had known from the beginning that Pier 7 held more than just 4 bodies, that the truth was deeper and more complicated than a simple murder. 35 years ago. "He's going to try to control the narrative," Victor said when Nico finished. "He'll tell me about Roberto's betrayal, about the necessity of the choice, about leaving evidence deliberately so I'd eventually know the truth. But he won't mention that there might be 5 or 6 or 10 other bodies buried at that site unless I specifically ask. He'll give me partial truth and hope it's enough to satisfy both me and the federal prosecutors." "Do you confront him with what we found?" Nico asked. "Or do you let him tell his version first and see what he omits?" Victor considered this, weighing tactical advantages. I let him talk first. I want to hear what he chooses to tell me versus what he chooses to hide. And then I decide whether his omissions are strategic or whether they're proof that he can't be trusted even now, even facing federal investigation, even knowing that lies will just make everything worse. He looked at his watch. 9:45 a.m. The meeting at Marcello's was in 75 minutes, but Victor's instincts, honed by 35 years of reading opponents and understanding when patience served better than action, told him that waiting was a mistake. If Salvatore had sent people to Pier 7 this morning, that meant he was still trying to control information flow, still trying to manage the narrative instead of just telling the full truth. That wasn't the foundation for the kind of honest conversation they needed. Victor made a decision. Change of plans. I'm not waiting until 11. I'm going to the Moretti restaurant now. If Salvatore wants to talk earlier, let's talk right now, before he's had time to rehearse his explanation and coordinate his story with Enzo. Dad, that's his territory, Nico warned. Walking into a Moretti operation without coordination during business hours when it's full of his people is exactly the kind of move that shows I'm not interested in playing games, Victor finished. Salvatore wants to meet early because he thinks controlling the timing gives him advantage. Fine. I'm taking that advantage away. I'm confronting him on his ground in front of his people, making it clear that the old rules about scheduling and territory and carefully managed conversations don't apply anymore. He grabbed his jacket. Stay here. Monitor the police radio frequencies. If this goes sideways, I want you ready to respond. And if it goes worse than sideways, Nico asked, then you become acting head of the family and you make better choices than I did, Victor said. It wasn't a joke. It was the kind of practical succession planning that men in their position made when walking into situations that could turn violent. The Moretti restaurant occupied a corner building in Queens, brick facade and red awnings, and the kind of established presence that said 3 generations had served food here. At 10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, it was in the transition period between breakfast and lunch prep, with a handful of early customers and kitchen staff moving through familiar routines. The smell of garlic and coffee and fresh bread carried out into the street, warm and inviting, completely at odds with the cold purpose that brought Victor through the front door. The hostess looked up from her reservation book, and her professional smile faltered when she recognized him. Everyone in both families knew Victor Castellano's face, knew that his presence in this restaurant without prior arrangement meant something had gone very wrong with the careful balance both families maintained. "Is Salvatore here?" Victor asked, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request to join someone for lunch. He's in the back office," the hostess stammered. "But Mr. Castellano, I should check if—" "No," Victor said, walking past her toward the back of the restaurant where the private offices were located. "I'll check myself." 2 Moretti soldiers, who'd been sitting at the bar, stood and moved to intercept him, hands moving toward concealed weapons. But Victor kept walking at the kind of absolute confidence that said touching him would start something none of them wanted. "I'm here to talk to Salvatore. Either you escort me back or you explain to him why you started a shooting war in the middle of his restaurant." The soldiers exchanged glances, clearly calculating whether this was a threat or a legitimate request for meeting. One of them spoke into a radio, then nodded to his partner. "This way. Hands visible at all times." They led Victor through the dining room, past kitchen doors where chefs looked up from prep work, down a short hallway to where the office door stood partially open. Salvatore was at his desk, reviewing paperwork, but he looked up as Victor entered, without knocking. For several seconds, both men just looked at each other, the moment of truth arriving sooner than planned, before either had fully prepared for what came next. "Victor," Salvatore said, standing slowly, his voice carrying no surprise, "I wasn't expecting you until 11. I decided we'd talked on phones and through intermediaries enough, Victor replied. You want to tell me what happened in 1989? Fine. Tell me now. No prepared speech, no coordinated story, just the truth. He moved closer to the desk. Tell me why you killed my father, Salvatore, and make it good, because I just spent the morning at Pier 7 discovering that 4 bodies might not be the full story. So whatever you're planning to tell me at Marcello's, whatever carefully edited version of the truth you've been rehearsing, I want the real version. All of it. Right now. Salvatore's expression shifted almost, imperceptibly. Recognition that Victor had found the secondary burial site, that the careful narrative he'd been building was already compromised before it started. He dismissed the soldiers with a gesture, waited until the office door closed, and then spoke with the quiet weight of a man who'd been carrying this story for 35 years. Roberto was selling information to the Russos during my brother's funeral, Salvatore said. Locations, security details, weak points in our defenses. Everything we'd trusted him with over years of business relationship he was giving to a family that wanted to destroy us during our most vulnerable moment. I confirmed it through multiple sources. I gave him a chance to stop, to explain, to understand that what he was doing would get innocent people killed. And? Victor prompted, his voice hard. He laughed, Salvatore said quietly. He said business was business, that the Russos were paying better, that loyalty only mattered when it was profitable. He said that in 6 months the Morettis wouldn't exist anyway, so what did it matter who he sold information to? The old man's hands gripped the desk edge. So I made a choice. His life or my family's survival. I chose my family. And the others? Victor asked. The other 3 bodies buried with him? The secondary site my people found this morning that your people were scanning. How many others, Salvatore? How many men did you bury at Pier 7 during your brother's transition? The silence that followed was answer enough. 4 confirmed deaths, Salvatore said finally. Roberto and 3 men who were working with him, all of them selling information to the Russos, all of them threats that needed to be eliminated during a 3-week period when any intelligence leak could have gotten my entire family killed. He met Victor's eyes directly. And yes, there might be more. There might be 5 or 6 or 7 bodies at that site, because November 1989 was a war I fought in. The dark, without the luxury of keeping precise records. I did what needed to be done to protect the people who depended on me. And I left evidence deliberately, because I knew someday someone would dig deep enough to find what I'd buried, and I wanted families like yours to at least know the truth eventually. You wanted us to know, Victor repeated, and something in his voice was dangerous. You killed my father. Let me believe for 35 years that he abandoned us, and you're framing it as some kind of mercy that you left his wallet and watched so eventually I could learn the truth? His hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the effort of containing rage that wanted to explode. You don't get credit for that, Salvatore. You don't get to claim you were doing me a favor by making sure his body would eventually surface. You stole 35 years from me. Years I spent becoming someone I didn't need to be, proving something I didn't need to prove, carrying shame that wasn't even real. I know, Salvatore said, and I'm sorry, not because sorry changes anything, but because it's true. What I did to Roberto was necessary. What I did to you by letting you believe he abandoned your family was cruelty. I took the easy path, made the hard choice to eliminate a threat, but couldn't make the hard choice to tell you the truth afterward. I'm a coward about that. I've been a coward about it for 35 years. The honesty in those words, the lack of defensiveness, the acknowledgement of failure beyond just the murder itself, took some of the heat out of Victor's rage. Not all of it, not even most of it, but enough that he could think tactically instead of just emotionally. Detective Martinez gave us 72 hours, Victor said. 72 hours to cooperate with the investigation or face federal prosecutors tearing apart both our families. You know what that means? It means the truth about Pier 7 is coming out regardless of what you or I want. The question is whether it comes out in a way that destroys both families, or whether we control the narrative enough to satisfy prosecutors without exposing ourselves to charges that put us in prison for the rest of our lives. I'm proposing we tell the truth, Salvatore said. Not the full truth, we can't afford to give prosecutors everything, but enough truth that Martinez can go to her bosses and say she solved a cold case, that she got cooperation from both families, that justice was served even if it came 35 years late. We give them Roberto's story, his betrayal, my response, the circumstances that made his death something other than random mob violence. We let them close their case with an explanation that makes sense, and we hope that's enough to avoid RICO investigation. And if it's not enough? Victor asked. If they want more, if they start digging into the secondary site and find 5 more bodies and decide that 4 murders might have been necessity, but 9 murders was systematic criminal activity, then we face that when it comes, Salvatore replied. But Victor, if we don't work together on this, if we let federal prosecutors drive a wedge between our families by making us compete to give them information first, then we both lose. They'll use our history against us, make us tear each other apart trying to save ourselves, and in the end, both families get destroyed. He stood and moved to the window that looked out on the restaurant's back garden. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking you to forget what I did. I'm asking you to recognize that right now we have a common enemy in federal prosecutors who want to make their careers by taking down organized crime families. And the only way we survive is together. Victor wanted to reject this, wanted to tell Salvatore to face federal investigation alone, wanted to walk away and let the Morettis burn for what they'd done. But his tactical mind recognized the truth in Salvatore's words. Divided, both families were vulnerable. United, they at least had a chance of managing the damage. We meet at Marcello's at 11 like planned, Victor said finally. But this time, we bring more than just our consigliere. I want my son Nico there. You bring your children, Dominic, Marco, Valentina, everyone who'll be affected by whatever we decide, because this isn't just about us anymore. This is about whether the next generation inherits our problems or inherits solutions. Salvatore nodded slowly. Agreed. The next generation should have a voice in what happens next. They're the ones who'll live with the consequences. Victor turned to leave, then paused at the door. Salvatore, one more thing. If I find out you're still hiding information, if there are more bodies or more secrets that come out after today, the cooperation ends. I don't care what Martinez threatens or what prosecutors want. If you lie to me again, even by omission, the truce is over. We'll both take our chances with federal investigation, because at least that's honest warfare instead of this. Understood, Salvatore said. No more lies, not even tactical ones. Victor left the restaurant through the back exit, avoiding the dining room full of curious eyes and worried soldiers. His phone buzzed immediately, a text from Nico. Police radio just reported that forensic team is expanding the Pier 7 excavation. They found the secondary site. Martinez is pushing for full investigation of the entire area. Victor typed back, meeting at Marcello's at 11 a.m. Both families, next generation included. We're telling them everything, and then we're deciding together how to handle Martinez's deadline. One thing was certain now. The 72-hour clock was ticking, and every hour brought them closer to federal intervention that could end both families' operations permanently. The question wasn't whether to cooperate anymore. The question was how much truth to tell and whether that truth could satisfy prosecutors without creating new problems worse than the old ones. The call came at 10:30 a.m. while both families were in transit to Marcello's. Victor's phone buzzed with an unknown number, and something about the timing made him answer, despite his usual policy of screening calls during strategic moments. "Mr. Castellano, this is Detective Martinez. I wanted to give you an update before you hear it through other channels. Our forensic team just expanded the excavation at Pier 7. We found 2 additional bodies at the secondary burial site your construction foreman mentioned. That brings the total to 6 confirmed victims, all buried during the same time frame, all showing similar trauma patterns." Victor felt his stomach drop. 6 bodies, not 4. Salvatore had admitted to 4, had suggested there might be more, but hearing the confirmation that there were at least 6 made the scope of November 1989 suddenly much larger, much harder to explain as anything other than systematic elimination of threats. "Have you identified the additional victims?" Victor asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Working on it," Martinez replied. "But, Mr. Castellano, I want you to understand something. 6 bodies buried at the same site during a compressed time frame starts to look less like isolated incidents and more like organized criminal activity. The kind of pattern that makes prosecutors very interested in understanding the full scope of what happened. So when you meet with Mr. Moretti today, I strongly suggest you both come to an understanding about how cooperative you're willing to be. Because 6 bodies changes the calculation significantly." She hung up before Victor could respond. Victor immediately called Salvatore. "6 bodies. Martinez just called me. They found 2 more at the secondary site." "I know," Salvatore said, his voice tight. "She called me 30 seconds before she called you. Enzo is already trying to determine who the additional victims were. But it's been 35 years, and records from that period were deliberately incomplete." He paused. "Victor, this changes what we need to talk about at Marcello's. 6 bodies isn't something we can explain as isolated defensive actions. 6 bodies is a pattern, and patterns are what prosecutors build RICO cases around. Then maybe it's time to stop managing information and start telling the whole truth," Victor said. "Not just about Roberto, but about November 1989 entirely. What actually happened during your brother's transition, how many threats you faced, why 6 men ended up buried at Pier 7. Because Martinez is right, 6 bodies demands a bigger explanation than the one you've been preparing." Before Salvatore could respond, both men's phones buzzed simultaneously with an incoming message from an unknown number. The text contained a single sentence and a series of photographs. "Salvatore Moretti didn't just bury threats, he buried witnesses. Ask him about the Russo meeting on November 12th, 1989. The photographs showed grainy surveillance images from 35 years ago. Men meeting in what looked like a warehouse, documents being exchanged, money changing hands. One of the faces was clearly Roberto Castellano. Another was a man Victor didn't recognize, and standing in the background, partially obscured but identifiable, was a younger Salvatore Moretti. Victor stared at the images, his mind racing through implications. If Salvatore had been present at a meeting with Roberto and the Russos, if there was photographic evidence of that meeting, then the story wasn't as simple as Salvatore discovering betrayal and responding. The story was more complicated, possibly more damning, definitely more dangerous if federal prosecutors got hold of these images. "Did you get the same message?" Victor asked. "Yes," Salvatore said, his voice strained. "Victor, those photographs are out of context. That meeting wasn't what it looks like." "Then what was it?" "Because right now it looks like you were doing business with the same people you claim Roberto betrayed us to. It looks like maybe you were more involved with the Russos than you've admitted, And maybe the 6 bodies aren't just about eliminating threats. Maybe they're about eliminating witnesses to deals you made. That's not, Salvatore started, then stopped himself. We need to talk in person, face to face, at Marcello's, because whoever sent those photographs is trying to drive a wedge between us right before we're supposed to meet. And if we let that happen, if we start accusing each other based on 35-year-old surveillance photos without context, then we're doing exactly what federal prosecutors would want us to do. Victor looked at the images again. Salvatore was right that they needed context, but he was also right that someone had these photographs, had been sitting on them for 35 years, and had chosen this exact moment, right before both families were supposed, to reach an understanding, to release them. That suggested sophisticated manipulation, someone who understood exactly how to create maximum chaos. Who else knows about these photographs? Victor asked. I don't know, Salvatore admitted, but the fact that they exist at all means someone documented that meeting, someone kept records, and someone has been holding on to those records for decades, waiting for exactly the right moment to deploy them. He paused. Victor, we're being played, both of us, and the question is whether we're smart enough to recognize it before we tear each other apart. Marcello's restaurant was already crowded when Victor arrived at 10:55 a.m. Not with regular customers, but with both families' key personnel, all of them summoned for what everyone understood was a crisis meeting that would determine whether the 12-year truce survived or whether everything collapsed into federal investigation and possible war. Victor had brought Nico and Elena. Salvatore had brought Enzo, Dominic, Marco, and Valentina. The restaurant's owner, Antonio Marcello, had cleared the main dining room and posted his most trusted people at the doors with instructions that no one entered without explicit permission. This was family business of the most serious kind. They sat at 2 adjacent tables, not quite facing each other like opponents, but not quite unified like allies either. The physical arrangement reflected the uncertain status of their relationship, not at war, not at peace, somewhere in the complicated middle where trust was theoretical but survival was practical. Before anyone could speak, every phone in the room buzzed simultaneously. Another message from the unknown sender. Detective Martinez received copies of these photographs 20 minutes ago. She's presenting them to the DA right now. Your 72-hour window just became 24 hours. Cooperate fully, or both families face indictment by tomorrow. The reaction was immediate. Anger, fear, calculation. Racing across multiple faces as everyone processed that they'd just lost 2 days of their deadline. Martinez now had evidence that complicated any explanation either family could offer, and prosecutors would use those photographs to suggest that whatever story came out of this meeting was coordinated cover-up rather than honest disclosure. Who sent these? Dominic demanded, looking at his father. Who has surveillance photos from 1989 and has been sitting on them for 35 years? Someone who wants both families destroyed, Enzo said quietly. Someone who understands that the photos don't tell the whole story, but they tell enough of a story to make prosecutors suspicious of anything we say. Someone who's been patient enough to wait decades for exactly the right moment to weaponize information. Or someone who wants us to panic, Valentina added, her strategic mind working through possibilities. Someone who knows that, under pressure, people make mistakes. We start accusing each other. We fracture our cooperation. We give prosecutors exactly what they want. 2 families turning on each other, trying to save themselves. Victor looked at Salvatore across the table. Tell me about the November 12th meeting. Tell me why you were there with Roberto and the Russos if he was supposedly betraying you. Salvatore nodded, understanding that there was no more room for partial truths or strategic omissions. The November 12th meeting was an attempted sting operation. Not official, We couldn't involve law enforcement because my family's operations wouldn't survive that kind of scrutiny. But I'd confirmed Roberto was selling information to the Russos, and I needed to know how much they knew and who else was involved. So I arranged a meet with Anton Russo, told him I was interested in making a deal, and showed up with Roberto to make it look legitimate. "You used my father as bait," Victor said, his voice flat. "I used your father as confirmation," Salvatore corrected. "I needed to see him interact with the Russos in a controlled environment, needed to understand whether he was just an information source or whether he was actively working to undermine my family." The meeting confirmed the worst. He wasn't just selling information for money. He was helping them plan how to move against us during the transition after Antonio died. He was identifying specific weaknesses, suggesting specific approaches, essentially serving as strategic consultant for their operation against my family. "And that's when you decided to kill him," Victor said. "That's when I decided he couldn't live," Salvatore replied. "Because the choice was him or everyone I loved. My wife was pregnant. My sons were young. If the Russos had succeeded with their plans, if they'd used Roberto's information to strike during our vulnerable period, the Moretti family would have been wiped out." He looked around the table at his own children. "You exist because I made that choice. I'm not asking you to be grateful. I'm asking you to understand what was at stake." "And the other 5? Nico asked. "The other people buried at Pier 7. 4 of them were Roberto's co-conspirators," Salvatore said. "Men who'd been helping him gather information. Men who knew too much about our weaknesses to leave walking around after we moved against Roberto. The 6th, he hesitated, and something in his expression suggested this one was harder to discuss. "The 6th was Anton Russo's son, Mikhail. He was at the November 12th meeting. He saw me there with Roberto. When we eliminated Roberto and his network, we couldn't leave Mikhail alive to tell his father that I'd been present at their meeting. Because if the Russos learned I'd been playing both sides, that I'd been gathering intelligence while pretending to negotiate, they would have come after my family with everything they had." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of what Salvatore had just admitted. 6 people dead, not just threats, but witnesses. Not just defensive actions, but offensive strikes that had included killing someone whose only crime was being present at the wrong meeting at the wrong time. "You killed 6 people to protect your family," Victor said slowly. "And you've been carrying that for 35 years, knowing that eventually someone would dig at Pier 7 and the truth would surface. That's why you left the personal effects. That's why you wanted families to know eventually, because living with that kind of secret was eating you alive." "Yes," Salvatore admitted. "And now that secret is out, and federal prosecutors are deciding whether those 6 deaths were justifiable homicide in the context of organized crime warfare, or whether they're evidence of systematic criminal activity that deserves RICO investigation. And the answer to that question will determine whether our families survive the next 24 hours. Elena spoke for the first time. "Then we need to decide what story we're telling. Not the whole truth. We can't afford to give prosecutors evidence they can use against us, but enough truth that Martinez can go to her bosses and say she got cooperation, she got answers, she closed a cold case with an explanation that makes sense, even if it's not pretty." "Roberto Castellano was an informant for the Russo family," Nico said, thinking out loud. "He was selling intelligence that threatened the Moretti family during a vulnerable transition period. Salvatore discovered the betrayal through his own intelligence gathering, including the November 12th meeting where he was conducting surveillance. He responded by eliminating Roberto and his network of co-conspirators in a series of actions that took place over several days in November 1989. The bodies were buried at Pier 7, which was Moretti property at the time, with personal effects deliberately left intact so that families would eventually learn what happened to their loved ones. That's a story that plays as organized crime conflict rather than random violence, Valentina added. It gives prosecutors what they want, solved cases with clear motivation and method. It admits to serious crimes, but frames them as historical events that happened during a period when both families were operating under different rules than they operate under now. And it requires both families to present a united front, Dominic said, understanding the strategic implications. If we tell that story together, if we cooperate in giving Martinez exactly what she needs to close her case, then we're demonstrating that the current truce is real, that both families have moved past the conflicts of 1989, that we're not ongoing criminal enterprises but historical organizations that have evolved into legitimate businesses. Victor looked around the table at faces from both families, all of them processing the same calculation. Cooperation meant admitting to serious crimes from 35 years ago, but it also meant controlling the narrative instead of letting prosecutors construct their own story from fragmentary evidence and surveillance photos that could mean anything. Before we agree to anything, Victor said, I want to know who sent those photographs, because someone has been sitting on evidence for 35 years and they chose now, the exact moment when both families are facing federal pressure, to release it. That's not coincidence, that's strategy. And I want to know whose strategy it is before I commit to cooperating with Martinez. As if on cue, every phone in the room buzzed again. This time, the message was longer. The photographs were taken by Anton Russo's security team on November 12, 1989. Anton died in 1992, but his nephew Dmitri has been holding on to evidence ever since, waiting for the right moment to use it. He's now offering you both a choice. Pay him $5 million to keep the additional photographs he has, showing the bodies being moved to Pier 7. Out of prosecutor hands, or face federal indictment based on evidence that proves premeditated murder and conspiracy. You have 12 hours to decide. Wire transfer instructions to follow. The room erupted in overlapping conversations, anger at being extorted, fear of additional evidence, calculation about whether $5 million was cheaper than federal investigation, debate about whether paying would just invite more demands. Victor let it run for 30 seconds, then stood and waited for silence to return. This is exactly what he wants, Victor said, his voice cutting through the noise. Dmitri Russo has been waiting decades to extract revenge for his uncle's death. He's been patient, strategic, and now he's trying to use federal pressure to force us to either pay him or turn on each other. We don't do either. We tell Martinez everything. We give her Dimitri's name. We explain that we're being extorted by someone who's been sitting on evidence for 35 years specifically to create this situation. We turn his strategy against him. That's risky, Enzo warned. If we tell Martinez about Dmitri, she'll want to know why the Russos have been holding evidence all this time. She'll start investigating their operations, which means she'll find connections to both our families from before the truce. She'll discover that the peace was negotiated partially because both sides were too exhausted to continue, but partially because the Russos were eliminated as a power center. She'll realize that November 1989 wasn't just about Roberto's betrayal. It was about destroying the Russo family's ability to compete in this territory. Then we tell her that too, Valentina said, standing beside Victor with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd been thinking through these options since the photographs first arrived. We tell her the whole story. November 1989 was a three-way conflict between Morettis, Castellanos and Russos. Roberto was selling information. Anton. Russo was planning a move against the Morettis, and Salvatore responded by eliminating both the informant network and the Russo operation. It was brutal, it was calculated, and it happened 35 years ago during a period when organized crime operated with different rules. We're not defending it. We're explaining it, and then we point out that since 1989, both our families have transitioned to legitimate operations. that the truce has held for 12 years, that we've been model examples of how former adversaries can move forward peacefully. "You're proposing we admit to everything," Marco said, looking at his sister with a mixture of respect and concern. "Not just the 6 bodies at Pier 7, but the entire elimination of the Russo family's operations. That's conspiracy charges, RICO charges, potentially federal prosecution for everyone at this table." "Or," Valentina countered, "it's honest cooperation with a federal investigation that results in closed cases from 35 years ago, recognition that both families have genuinely reformed, and avoidance of ongoing criminal prosecution because we can demonstrate that the enterprises we run now bear no resemblance to what existed in 1989. She looked around the table. "The choice is between controlled disclosure, where we shape the narrative, or letting prosecutors discover information piecemeal and draw their own conclusions about what it means." Victor found himself nodding. "She's right. We're being offered a binary choice by Dimitri Russo. Pay him or face prosecution. But there's a third door. We walk into Martinez's office right now, we bring both families' attorneys, and we make a proffer. We tell her we're prepared to cooperate fully with her investigation, to provide detailed information about November 1989, including the Russo family's involvement, and to help her understand why 6 people ended up buried at Pier 7. In exchange, we want assurances that our cooperation will be used to close historical cases rather than open new investigations into current operations." "That's a significant risk," Eleanor said, her prosecutor's daughter instincts evaluating the legal exposure. "Once you start talking to federal investigators, once you admit to crimes, even historical ones, you lose control of how that information gets used. They can promise immunity, but those promises are conditional and limited. If they decide the crimes are too serious or too systematic, they can revoke immunity and use everything you told them against you." "Then we don't ask for immunity," Nico said. "We ask for something better, full transparency in exchange for acknowledgement that both families have fundamentally changed. We give them everything about 1989, including evidence about Dimitri Russo's current extortion attempt. We show them that we're being victimized by someone who's trying to use their investigation as leverage. We position ourselves not as defendants trying to avoid prosecution, but as reformed organizations being targeted by actual current criminals." The strategy was audacious. Instead of defending against prosecution, go on offense by helping prosecutors understand who the real current threat was. Instead of hiding from historical crimes, acknowledge them completely while demonstrating that the organizations responsible for those crimes no longer existed in their 1989 form. "We'd need both families to coordinate," Dominic said. "Complete alignment on what we're telling them, how we're framing it, what evidence we're providing. If one family tells a story that contradicts the other family's version, prosecutors will use that inconsistency to justify investigation of both." "Then we write the story together," Salvatore said. "Now, today, both families in this room, we document what happened in November 1989 from start to finish. We include Roberto's betrayal, the November 12th meeting, the decision to eliminate threats, the burial at Pier 7, the subsequent peace, negotiations, the 12-year truce, everything. We create a comprehensive narrative that explains the past and demonstrates the present, and then we take that narrative to Martinez as a unified presentation from 2 families who are committed to cooperation and transparency." "How long do we have?" Victor asked, checking his watch. 11:45 a.m. The message from Dimitri had given them 12 hours to respond to his extortion demand, but Martinez's deadline for cooperation was 24 hours from this morning, which meant they had until tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. "We have about 18 hours to write history," Valentina said, And then we have about 6 hours after that before Martinez expects our cooperation. That's enough time if we work efficiently and stop second-guessing every detail." She was right. They had a narrow window to turn disaster into opportunity, to convert federal pressure into a mechanism for finally telling the truth about November 1989, and to position both families as reformed organizations rather than ongoing criminal enterprises. It would require everyone at this table to agree, to trust each other with information that could be weaponized, to bet everything on the strategy of radical transparency instead of continued secrecy. "We do it," Victor said, making the decision that would define what happened next. Both families, complete cooperation, full disclosure about 1989, and unified presentation to Martinez. We control the narrative by telling it first. We handle Dmitri by giving prosecutors evidence of his current extortion. And we save both families by demonstrating that we're not who we were 35 years ago. He looked at Salvatore. "But, Salvatore, I need you to understand something. This only works if you tell me everything. No more omissions, no more strategic editing, no more secrets that surface later and make everything we just said look like coordinated lying. This is the moment where you decide whether you trust me. Enough to give me the full truth, or whether you keep hiding parts of the story and risk both families getting destroyed." Salvatore met Victor's eyes with an expression that held decades of regret, relief, and resignation. "No more secrets. I'll tell you everything about November 1989. Every person who died, every decision I made, every consequence that followed. And then you decide whether understanding the full story changes anything, or whether you still want revenge for what I did to your father." "I don't want revenge," Victor said quietly. "I want peace. Not the fragile truce we've had for 12 years, but actual peace built on honest understanding of what happened and why. That's the only way forward that doesn't end with both families destroyed." He extended his hand across the table. Salvatore looked at it for a long moment, understanding that this handshake would mean more than the one that had ended the last war. This one would mean confession, cooperation, and the shared risk that came with complete transparency. But it would also mean both families had a chance to survive what should have destroyed them. Salvatore took Victor's hand. "Peace, then, built on truth instead of convenient lies. That's worth the risk." The next 18 hours were the most intense collaboration either family had experienced. They took over Marcello's restaurant completely, turning the private dining room into a war room where both families' key people worked to document every relevant detail of November 1989. Enzo and Elena took the lead on creating legal framework, a proffer letter that would structure their cooperation with Martinez while establishing parameters on how information could be used. Dominic and Nico coordinated the factual timeline, interviewing their respective fathers and cross-referencing memories to build a comprehensive picture of events. Valentina and Marco worked on the strategic presentation, how to frame the information so prosecutors understood the historical context without minimizing the seriousness of what had happened. By 4 a.m., they had a document that ran 47 pages, detailed chronology of events, photographic evidence of the Russo family's operations, documentation of the threat Roberto posed, explanation of the November 12th meeting, accounting for all 6 bodies, description of the subsequent peace negotiations, and comprehensive overview of both families' legitimate operations since 1989. It was confession, history lesson, and legal defense combined into a narrative that both families could present with unified voice. At 7 a.m., Victor, Salvatore, Elena, Enzo, Nico, Dominic, and Valentina walked into Detective Martinez's office, They'd called ahead, told her they were ready to provide the cooperation she'd requested, and asked for her to coordinate presence from the DA's office, so they only had to tell the story once. Martinez looked at the group with surprise and calculation. 2 families. That should be enemies. Presenting together, all of them looking exhausted but determined. Mr. Castellano, Mr. Moretti, this is unexpected. We're here to cooperate fully with your investigation, Elena said, her legal training taking point. Both families, complete transparency, every relevant detail about what happened at Pier 7 in November 1989. We've prepared a comprehensive proffer that documents events, provides context, and offers information that will help you close not just the Pier 7 case, but several related investigations. She set the document on Martinez's desk. We're also prepared to provide information about an active extortion scheme by Russo, who's been using your investigation as leverage to try to extract money from both families. Martinez took the document and started reading. Her expression shifted from skepticism to surprise to something like respect as she worked through the pages. This wasn't defensive lawyers trying to minimize exposure. This was comprehensive accounting of serious crimes, presented with enough context that prosecutors could understand what had happened and why, but presented voluntarily rather than extracted through interrogation. This is 35 years of information, Martinez said after reading for 10 minutes. Roberto Castellano working with the Russo family, Salvatore Moretti infiltrating their operations, the elimination of 6 people during a 3-week period in November 1989, the subsequent peace negotiations. You're confessing to conspiracy, multiple murders, organized criminal activity. We're acknowledging what happened, Salvatore corrected. Not defending it, not minimizing it, but explaining it in full context, so you understand that the organizations we run today bear no resemblance to what existed in 1989. That document shows you how 2 families transitioned from violent conflict to peaceful coexistence, from illegal operations to legitimate businesses, from being problems to being examples of how reform is possible. Why now? Martinez asked. You've both been sitting on this information for 35 years. Why come forward today? Why together? Why with this level of detail? Because Russo is using your investigation as extortion leverage, Nico said. He's been holding surveillance photographs from the November 12th meeting for decades, waiting for exactly the right moment to deploy them. He sent them to you yesterday to create pressure, then sent messages to both families demanding $5 million to keep additional evidence out of prosecutor hands. We're not paying extortionists, and we're not letting someone manipulate your investigation to create conflict between families that have been at peace for 12 years. Martinez pulled out her phone and checked messages. I did receive surveillance photographs yesterday from an anonymous sender. November 12th, 1989, warehouse meeting, several participants including Roberto Castellano and someone who appears to be Salvatore Moretti. The sender claimed the photographs proved ongoing organized crime activity. The photographs prove that Salvatore was conducting surveillance on Roberto and the Russos, Valentina explained. He was there gathering intelligence, confirming his suspicions about betrayal, documenting who was involved. That meeting is referenced in our proffer with full context. And the person who sent you those photographs is Russo, who inherited his uncle's vendetta along with his uncle's evidence collection. Martinez read more of the document, and Victor could see her processing the strategic implications. This was the kind of cooperation prosecutors dreamed of. Willing witnesses, comprehensive documentation, multiple perspectives that all aligned into consistent narrative. If she took this to her bosses, if she could present 2 formerly adversarial families coming together to provide transparency about historical crimes, it would look like major win for law enforcement. I need to bring the DA into this conversation, Martinez said finally. What you're offering is significant, but it's also confessing to federal crimes. I can't make agreements about immunity or prosecution that has to come from people with authority to make those decisions. We understand, Elena said. We're prepared to wait while you coordinate with your superiors. But, Detective, we need you to understand that this cooperation has a shelf life. If Dmitry Russo escalates his extortion attempt, if either family faces threats that require defensive response, the unified front we're presenting today might not survive. We're offering you this cooperation now because both families have decided that transparency serves everyone's interests better than continued secrecy. But that decision is conditional on federal prosecutors recognizing what we're offering and treating it appropriately. Over the next 6 hours, Martinez coordinated with the DA's office, with federal prosecutors, with her own chain of command. Victor and Salvatore sat in separate conference rooms with their respective families and attorneys, waiting for word on whether the cooperation they'd offered would be accepted or whether they'd just given prosecutors evidence to destroy both families. At 2 p.m., Martinez returned with a representative from the U.S. Attorney's Office, a woman named Catherine Wong, who specialized in organized crime prosecution. Wong was 45, precise, and clearly someone who'd made her career taking down criminal enterprises. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I've read your proffer," Wong said, sitting down across from where both families had reconvened in Martinez's conference room. "It's comprehensive, detailed, and implicates both families in serious federal crimes. Multiple murders, conspiracy, organized criminal activity spanning decades. Under normal circumstances, this document would be foundation for indictments that put everyone in this room in prison for the rest of their lives." Victor felt tension spike around the table, but he kept his expression neutral. Wong was establishing leverage, making sure everyone understood the stakes before she revealed what deal she'd been authorized to offer. "However," Wong continued, "the U.S. Attorney's Office has reviewed not just the historical crimes you've confessed to, but the pattern of behavior since. We've examined both families' current operations. The Castellano construction business is legitimate. Permits, taxes, employee records, all clean. The Moretti restaurant and property management operations are similarly legitimate. We've found no evidence of ongoing criminal activity beyond what would be typical of any large business operating in New York." She paused. "Which means we have a choice. We can prosecute you for crimes from 35 years ago and destroy 2 organizations that have genuinely reformed. Or we can acknowledge that the purpose of prosecution is deterrence and rehabilitation, and that you've already achieved both, without criminal justice system intervention." "You're offering immunity," Elena said, her legal mind recognizing where this was heading. "We're offering conditional non-prosecution," Wong corrected. "Not quite immunity. You've confessed to serious crimes, and those confessions are now on record, but the U.S. Attorney has determined that prosecution doesn't serve public interest when the defendants have voluntarily provided full cooperation, when the crimes are historical, when the defendants have demonstrated genuine reform, and when prosecution would primarily serve to punish rather than prevent future crimes." "What are the conditions?" Enzo asked. Wong pulled out a document. 5-year probationary period during which both families' operations remain under federal monitoring. Annual audits of both businesses to ensure continued legitimate operation. Immediate reporting of any contact from Dmitry Russo or other parties attempting extortion. Full cooperation with any investigations related to the Russo family's current activities. And most importantly, maintenance of the peace between both families. If you go to war with each other at any point during the next 5 years, the non-prosecution agreement is void and everything you've told us gets used against you." Victor looked at Salvatore. 5 years of federal monitoring was significant intrusion into both families' operations. It would limit flexibility, require transparency about decisions that both families preferred to keep private, and create ongoing exposure to the same prosecutors who now held confessions to multiple murders. But the alternative was certain prosecution, almost certain conviction and destruction of both families' current operations. "We accept," Victor said. "Agreed," Salvatore confirmed. Wong slid the document across the table. "Then we have a deal. Both families sign. Both families comply with monitoring conditions. Both families maintain peace. And in 5 years, if you've demonstrated that your reform is genuine and ongoing, this entire matter gets permanently closed." The signatures took less than 5 minutes. The implications would last for 5 years or longer, depending on whether both families could genuinely maintain the cooperation they demonstrated over the past 36 hours. As they left the federal building, Victor found himself walking beside Salvatore in the late afternoon sun. 36 hours ago, they'd been on the edge of war. Now they were bound together by federal monitoring agreement that made conflict impossible, without both families facing destruction. "This isn't how I thought this would end," Victor said. "How did you think it would end?" Salvatore asked. "With one of us dead, probably," Victor admitted, "with revenge or justice or whatever word I was using to justify wanting you to pay for what you did to my father." He looked at the older man. "But I learned something over the past 36 hours. I learned that my father wasn't innocent. He was betraying your family for money, helping people who wanted to destroy you and your children. What you did was brutal, but it wasn't murder for its own sake. It was defense, ugly defense, permanent defense, but defense nonetheless." "Does that change how you feel about it?" Salvatore asked. "No," Victor said honestly. "It doesn't give me my father back. It doesn't undo 35 years of lies. But it makes revenge pointless. Because the person I'd be avenging wasn't who I thought he was, and the person I'd be punishing was trying to protect the same things I would have protected if I'd been in his position." He stopped walking and looked directly at Salvatore. "I don't forgive you. I'm not sure I ever will, but I understand you. And understanding is enough foundation to build peace on, even if forgiveness never comes." Salvatore nodded slowly. "I can live with that. I've been living with worse for 35 years. They shook hands one final time, and it felt different from all the previous handshakes, less about ending conflict and more about acknowledging shared survival, less about victory or defeat, and more about two families choosing to move forward, despite history that would always be there, would always be complicated, would always carry weight that their children would inherit. The blood price had been paid, not in violence but in truth, not in revenge but in cooperation, not in destroying what remained, but in protecting what both families had built despite the darkness in their foundations. 6 months later, both families had settled into the reality of federal monitoring. The audits were intrusive, but manageable. The reporting requirements were annoying, but not impossible. The restriction on conflict between families turned out to be unnecessary, because both Castellanos and Morettis had discovered that cooperation was more profitable than competition had ever been. Valentina Moretti and Nico Castellano met occasionally, not as representatives of their families, but as two people who'd helped prevent a war, and who understood that the next generation's job was to build something better than what they'd inherited. They compared notes on how the federal monitoring was affecting operations, discussed strategies for managing the pressure, and planned for the future when both families would no longer be defined primarily by what their fathers had done in 1989. Victor stood at Pier 7 on a cold February morning, watching construction crews pour new foundations for the development that would eventually rise on ground where 6 bodies had been buried for 35 years. The site would become luxury housing, modern and clean, with no external indication of the history underneath it. But Victor would always know, would always remember standing here at dawn, learning that his father hadn't abandoned him, that the story he'd built his life around was fiction. Across the river, Salvatore sat in his study, looking at crime scene photographs he'd kept as reminder of choices made in darkness. 6 men dead because he'd chosen his family's survival over every other consideration. 6 families destroyed because he'd been protecting one. The math had made sense at the time. It still made sense strategically. But it also carried weight that got heavier every year, not lighter. Lucia found him there, as she always did when his mind went to dark places. She didn't say anything, just placed soup in front of him. Still too much soup, always too much, because that's how she showed love when words weren't enough. "Did we do the right thing?" Salvatore asked, cooperating with the prosecutors, telling them everything, binding ourselves to 5 years of federal monitoring? "We did the possible thing," Lucia replied. "The right thing would have been not burying 6 people at Pier 735 years ago. But that choice is gone. We can't undo it. We can only choose how we handle the consequences, and cooperating, being honest, protecting our children from inheriting our wars, those are better choices than the alternatives." "Victor still hasn't forgiven me," Salvatore said. "But he understands you," Lucia pointed out, "and he's not trying to kill you, which is significant improvement from where we were 36 hours after Pier 7. Understanding is enough foundation to build peace on. Forgiveness can come later or not at all. But as long as both families are moving forward instead of backward, as long as your grandchildren are safe, as long as the peace holds, we've done enough." Salvatore looked at the photographs one final time, then locked them in the safe where they would stay. Reminder of a past that couldn't be changed but could be learned from. "No more lies," he said. "If the next crisis comes, if our families face another choice between truth and convenience, we tell the truth. Because lies compound. They build on themselves until the weight becomes unbearable. I won't do that to our children." "No more lies," Lucia agreed. "Whatever comes next, we face it honestly." The phone rang. Victor calling, with a question about coordinating on a joint development project that would benefit both families. Salvatore answered, and his voice carried the careful professionalism of men who understood they weren't friends, weren't family, but were bound together by history and federal monitoring and the shared recognition that cooperation served everyone better than conflict. The blood price had been paid. The truth had been told. The peace would hold, not because both families loved each other, but because they understood that the alternative, more violence, more secrets, more bodies buried in dark places, would destroy everything they'd built and everyone they loved. Understanding was enough. For now, understanding was enough.